I'll introduce the people we've asked up to come and serve on the panel first of all. Then I think we'll just go straight into it. Patrick, you've all heard and met. Next in line is Dr. Gary Mantle. Gary's the director of the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, which I was thinking of as Patrick was laying down certain challenges, which I was itching to respond to, and couldn't because I've been asked to chair, and I think I now know why I've been asked to chair. I think it's just shut me up. But really, under Gary's directorship, I think we want to think of the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust perhaps slightly differently as you would with the classic idea when someone mentions Wildlife Trust. The Wiltshire Trust is a farming body. It farms on its own land, on its nature reserves, and is also campaigned along on a wide array of environmental issues. So I think I'm particularly glad to have Gary here tonight. Next we have Kath from Swindon Pulse. Swindon Pulse is Swindon's very own whole food workers co-op. He's been doing it since 1976.
Respect.
And I think quite often there's perhaps a tendency for some of us, to sort of maybe talk a bit more than do. And I think Pulse have been doing day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out for many years. So very glad to have Pulse on the panel tonight as well. And I was going to say, talking about talking, at the end, we have Jerry. Jerry's one of the key volunteers with SCAN. He's also been very active with Transition Swindon, and in particular around the food area. So I think it's critically important that we have Jerry up here tonight as well. That's our local panel. We have Patrick too. I'm quite happy just to sort of take it from here in a fairly informal way. But let's have the first question.
Hi, just trying to combine what I've heard today, Patrick, from yourself on resilience, an aspect I haven't really considered so much. I can see the sense of it. But there's a problem battling resilience versus the need with 7,000 million people of quantity of food production. And in this perfect storm, peak oil makes fertiliser more expensive. If farmers say, well, I'll use a little less fertiliser, I don't mind losing a bit on the crop, fine for that farmer, but then we all go a bit more hungry. So therefore there is a problem as fertiliser use goes down, and I've learned the hard way in 15 years, starting from complete ignorance, Simon well knows, but now to a point where I know how important it is to get fertility down, and I'm evangelical about not using fertiliser, and I'm well aware that when fertiliser is around, everything grows that much quicker. Trouble is, you do get, if things grow quicker like wheat, you do get more tonnage per acre. So start using less fertiliser. Yes, it may be healthier wheat, but it's less wheat. And therefore the quantification to feed 7,000 million people if global fertiliser use goes down, how do you balance the organic resilience you describe, which is ideal for the 3,000 million people on this planet, with the problem of trying to feed 7,000 million?
Yeah, really important. I mean, the key question, I'd say, that is often, the question you've asked is often characterised as, can organic farming feed the world? You know?
Yes.
And I personally think that is the wrong question, because it evades the truth of the matter, which is that we have been treating nature's capital in the form of fossil fuels, which have been laid down in the form of coal, oil and gas over 150 million years, and in the last 75 million years we've used half of them. So we've consumed fossil fuel energy, which is really just photosynthetic stuff laid down by the planet, as if it was capital, as if it was income. And that is completely unsustainable, and we could just carry on mining, we probably will carry on mining the rest of the fossil fuels until they run out, or nearly run out, because it'll be, as Rob Hopkins says, progressive. So the real challenge is how, not whether, but how we will produce sufficient food for whatever the world population peaks at without using fossil fuels, because they're not going to be available. And so it's a cop-out to say, well, you'll never feed the world with organic farming. The question is, how can we feed the world managing on truly continuingly available renewable inputs? And I think the answer is we'll have to enter a period of massive innovation in agriculture, and we'll have to change our diet, because in a sustainably farmed Britain, cereals would halve. Cereal yields would halve. So, fast forward, imagine all farmers in the UK adopting sustainable agriculture techniques. You would have to then build fertility through crop rotation. Now that means going through a clover grass fertility building phase of probably approaching half the period of the total rotation. So if you have like a 7-year rotation, 3 years at least will be in clover and grass to build the fertility. You will then need something to convert that clover and grass into food, and that's probably a ruminant animal. And the role of ruminants in contributing towards climate change has been much maligned, because actually the carbon sequestration effect of the grass clover ley will offset the methane emission of the ruminants. So what we need is grass-fed, forage-fed ruminant animals, that's cattle producing milk or beef, or sheep producing meat. So in a sustainably farmed Britain we can eat quite a lot of red meat actually, and dairy products of the right kind, but we'll have to really massively reduce our consumption of white meat. So white meat, pork and poultry, will be fed a lot more on grass, because grass can actually produce, it's amazing how much eggs and pork can be produced by grass, because these animals, even though they haven't got a rumen, they can still graze. Plus waste products like swill will have to be fed to pigs again, whey, my farm's producing a lot of whey, that needs to be fed to pigs. So, but at the end of the day, white meat's become the meat of choice for a lot of people now, and that's going to end. Because 50% of all the cereals that are grown in the UK are fed to livestock. So, it's basically fundamental change in our diet. So the diet of the mid-21st century is going to be lots of vegetables, some cereals, because we can eat them, because that's straight to the source sort of thing, and quite a bit of red meat, but less probably overall, but you can continue to eat red meat and dairy, but big change in much less white meat. So I think the answer is we hope we can feed 9 billion people. We don't know exactly how, but one of the things is going to be a major structural change in our diet.
So, changing diet and farming, I'm wondering if any of the other panel members have a view on that.
Well, I agree with Patrick in many respects with your answer, but and I think I'd start with the same place as you, which is it's the wrong way around of putting the question. Fundamentally, we're living amongst natural systems, and what population of humans can natural systems support? But having said, and often, the population question is ducked, because it's very difficult. But actually, in this case, I don't think we're quite up against that, because we don't yet, I think, have sufficient evidence to know whether or not we can feed the population that we anticipate there will be. One of the big issues is the amount of waste, and food waste is a huge issue. And so it is about change of diet, it's a change of behaviour, and I think it's about changing attitudes much more broadly, and I think it comes back to the kind of philosophy that underpinned the formation of the Soil Association, which was about public awareness and understanding around this range of issues. Patrick is a great fan of Prince Charles, as am I, and one of the things that he's been talking about a lot is this whole concept of harmony. Because if you change your diet away from white meat, what you'll hear a lot of health people talking about is, well, cholesterol is going to become a problem, and people are going to suffer without health. So you have to think in a much more holistic terms about achieving wholeness and wellness of people and happiness. And so it's not just about simply continuing as you are, but just change your diet. It's a change much more fundamentally of the nature and structure of society as a whole. And that's what we have to work towards. It is about grasping the moment that we have to achieve that fundamental change and to lead and support that transition of society into a much more sustainable place than it is now. And change of diet and change of farming practices is part of that. It's not the whole story, it's part of that story. It's fundamentally important.
Before we go to anyone else, anything else to add? No? Jerry?
Work on this hasn't begun, but who's heard of the Community Forest programme? Right, that's good. That's a start. Well, We haven't started to work on a local food plan yet. There was talk about it at the One Planet Swindon event that Kevin MacLeod embarrassed the council into. I call it What Planet Swindon, not One Planet Swindon. And so I think that we can't anticipate what a food plan would look like, but you need to begin to think about Swindon and surround as a community farm. People doing it in their back gardens. Old folks who maybe can't dig, sort of letting out to younger folks who do and exchanging and so on. At one of the other Food Networks event that Mike Thomas and I, the other transition guru in Swindon, held, one or two of the farms were thinking about, might they nearly teach people to grow food on the farm? This sort of idea, to go back to their gardens, because these skills have been lost in a way. So I think you begin to. It won't be as mobilised as the war effort, but we need to begin some sort of lower key community farm, Swindon as a community farm effort, or a total community allotment type idea, don't we?
Thanks, Joe. Mike, I saw you had your hand up. You want to chip in and just
if I may just chip in on the debate on the question that was asked there. Recent research, I've been to a conference in Ireland recently, and one of the people speaking has done a lot of research on this very point about feeding the world with organic agriculture. And I think that we should bear in mind that 90% of the population rise up to about 2050 is going to take place in the third world. And third world farmers generally double their yield by using organic methods in conventional farming.
Absolutely.
So I think that's an important point. But I'd also like to introduce a note of controversy as well with regard to biodynamic farming, because I've read the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, which I find some of them really disturbing, and some of them very weird. So I feel the same about homeopathy, in fact. So I'm just wondering if mentioning biodynamic farming isn't going to in some way discredit all these ideas about sustainable agriculture. And I agree with 98% of that. So.
I think clearly that's a question for Patrick, who mentioned it.
Well, just on your first point, I think it's so good that you mentioned that, because there's a report which came out in 2008 called the IAA STD report. I can't remember it. It's basically an international report with 400 scientists who submitted evidence, and they showed exactly what you said, that in developing countries, especially in Africa, if you deploy methods of production which build soil fertility based on organic principles, you can equal and very often exceed the yields of conventional agriculture, because the main limitation on conventional agriculture is impoverished soil, which needs to have increased humus or organic matter, and then that creates a water holding capacity. So actually, if, as you say, the population increase is going to be a lot to do with developing countries, then there's very good cause for hope from the experience of those systems. So I agree with you totally. I think it's very interesting, your second point, because in a world of reductionist science, where, you know, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist, and all that sort of thing, which has prevailed for so long now, to speak about the not yet explained, or, you know, energetic stuff, or the kind of stuff that you were just talking about, which is in the Prince's book Harmony, has been kind of non-PC, or, you know, not acceptable in scientific terms. But I think one of the issues that I've really come to understand is that this linear reductionist approach, which tends to be the approach which is adopted by modern science, is actually not how things happen in real life, and certainly not in agriculture. I mean, sustainable farming systems are systemic, and they recognise the principle that everything is connected. And I think when you add to that the research, I'm outing myself, I have a very strong wish to find a way of living on this planet for the brief time I'm on it, which gives meaning and gives me a sense of purpose. And for me, you know, that does include the spiritual dimension, because I have not everyone has this, but I personally am interested in the not yet explained, and the deeper sense of, you know, what I'm trying to bring in my life while I'm on this planet. And I think that we've reached a time where it should be acceptable to talk about that publicly, whilst at the same time speaking about the political and practical steps which are needed to move in a more sustainable direction. So, although I respect your, what's antipathy towards homeopathy or towards biodynamic farming, I think it should be, an interest in that should be able to coexist in the discussion about these issues.
Thank you. The gentleman in the blue checked shirt has his hand up.
To kind of answer that question, I think one's got to also sort out the difference between people who adopt and profess something and the actual thing that they're professing. And I think religion is a good example where it's possibly man's interpretation and the way we live those ideals rather than, if you get down to the basics, what stands behind them. And if you go into maths, they use I, which is actually a kind of fictitious number, and you can do a calculation with that fictitious number, and providing you treat it as if it was there, things will work out right. And I think that when one doesn't understand something, you can have a concept that you don't understand, but kind of value it, and if you adopt that principle, it will bring results. And I've been organic farming for ages, and I can, whenever you do something differently, people are uncomfortable with that, and it'll be my shortcomings as a person that'll let down organics, and not the system of organics, I think, or biodynamics, or transition. I mean, there are people who would think this room's full of loonies, if they came and sat here. And it's us as individuals who will let it down rather than what stands behind what you're trying to do, if you like.
Thank you. I saw another hand up.
Completely different question, but I've just picked up on the point that Patrick made in his talk about Swindon, for instance, as an example, the town of Swindon needing to become more local, and so us needing to have a more local relationship with the food producers around Swindon. And this is where I want to try and bring Kath in, because I think this is what Pulse does, because Pulse stocks quite a lot of local food. But I'm wondering if we want to expand that, maybe expand what you stock so that more people can get exposure. Are there any things that stand in your way? So, for instance, if you started a scheme whereby you say you take in eggs from local producers that just have some chickens in their backyard, can you do that legally, or are you not allowed to do that?
Very good question. I'm not sure, actually.
We're not allowed to say they're organic.
No, you're not allowed to say they're organic, for one thing. And yeah, they probably are. And you're not allowed to sell them. You've got to have them boxed. You can't have them just, go, here are the eggs, bring your own boxes. I don't think you can do that anymore. There's all sorts of bits of sort of red tape like that sort of does stand in the way. I mean, we do things. I mean, people come in and go, oh, I've got spare apples in the garden, would you like them? We do have them out in the shop. We don't say they're organic.
Right.
Bring your stuff in, folks. We do encourage it as much as we can, but there is a lot of things that do stand in the way of that, I think.
The chapter's here, I think.
Well, I was just going to say about it's all very well what are perceived by the public to be a bunch of elitist organic farmers doing a really good thing, but aren't the likes of Tesco, Monsanto and governments and the way they treat farmers and the way they run the whole thing, they're just going to crush it and buy it out of existence before it even gets going if we're not careful, because you have to be talking to those people to get them to change their practices. Absolutely. Because the only way they're going to say all along, they're going to say the only way to deal with the food crisis is GM. Because the only way we can grow enough stuff and that's what they're going to do. And the public will fall for it because they're stupid. They're buying from Tesco, so they are stupid. They will just go and buy it. The only way you can have cheap food is if it's GM.
Yeah, but that's not fair, is it?
But that's what they will do.
Yeah, but people will. I'm arguing with my co-host.
I'd love to see the meeting.
What I was going to say is, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, they are stupid. Because it's all very well doing this, and it's great. Going back to Mike's thing about Demeter. Demeter is a bit far out there, and I know what you're saying about the spiritual aspect of it, but you have to accept that there are forces that are against this. Big money, big pharma, the agricultural industry. And they will pick up on anything that they think is going to turn people. And the thing is, it's all very well going on, people are stupid, but you have got to get to the man that is standing in Iceland buying crap for a pound. I put my hand up, I went to Iceland today. But, do you know what I mean?
I've been in Tesco today.
You've got to get out there and get to people at the grassroots. It's no good going, again, because it will become an elitist thing. Oh, it's those people over there, oh, isn't sustainable marvellous?
Yes.
That's fine. That is how they marginalise you. We have to
They're
get out
doing,
there.
already they're doing it. They're
Yeah.
normalising you to GM, all the stuff they said about it. Oh, that's not really that
It's
bad.
fine,
That's
it's fine.
right.
Let's
They're just
let
normalising
the
you. Taking
panel
time.
respond
That's
to
what
this one, because I've been given a hard time over this in the past as well, so I'm interested to hear.
But I just think you're absolutely right that these people are very powerful. And Eric Schlosser stood up at the top of this Washington conference. He gave the first talk and he said, it is not elitist to be concerned about the public's right to healthy and nutritious food. What is elitist is that a handful of multinational corporations, for self-vested interest and profit, put their own vested interests ahead of the public interest. And I think he's completely right. And the question that you raise is, what is more powerful than those corporate multinational interests? And I think there was only one force, and that's informed public opinion.
Yeah, public
And
opinion.
the only way we're going to confront that is to, so I do agree with what you said, that you have to believe that there is an innate intelligence in people, that if you give them the information, they will respond to it.
Yeah.
And the British media have not been helpful recently.
Yeah.
You know that.
Disinformation.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to that? Politically, all these big companies pay millions and billions of pounds worth of tax. Governments aren't going to say, oh no, we don't want the tax garden organically or environmentally. So then the political aspect is against it as well.
You're so right, and I was mentioning Cameron earlier. Would Cameron, at a point where they're desperately trying to keep down food inflation, want to advocate policies which passed on the true cost of industrial food?
No.
Of course not, because it's going to be inflationary. So they're going to be with Tesco's all the way on this. So it's a big issue. But even so, we have to get this discussion out there, because that's the only antidote to it. You know, if enough people understand what's going on.
Like I say, it's about people talking.
I'm noting a lot of hands up here, so I want to give the panel another chance to respond to that if they wish to, and then we'll move on to another question.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I think the key to addressing the problem is very much, as has been said, about improving understanding. I am staggered by what I call environmental illiteracy. We have programs for literacy and numeracy for children and for adults, but actually the level of illiteracy around fundamental environmental principles is staggering. And the disconnection between people and the natural world that sustains them is staggering. And part of the challenge I believe we face collectively is to try and do something about that. Whether we do it organisationally, through the work of organisations like Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, where we try and build resilience programs, and we work with young people, we work with people who are unemployed, and we work with volunteers, and we work with enthusiasts, and we work with the informed, and we work with the ill-informed. We will work with everybody, but we're only scratching the surface. And actually, we need a multitude of ambassadors and champions who take that message out to a much broader public. And the messages have to be reinforced time and time again before those take seed and take root in people's hearts. To just draw that back to a moment, the conversation about the spiritual, we shouldn't be prescriptive in how people understand and how people react. How will we get people to understand scientific principles if they don't care? If they do simply not care about any of it, if they have no passion, no love affair with nature, with the natural world, we haven't got a hope. They've got to care about it somewhere, at some point. And what is it that's going to turn them on to something that you and I may share and value? You've got to think about different messages for different people. Young people have a very different agenda to older people like us. I wasn't including you there.
I'm 1950.
We have a very different perspective on the world to young people, but we have to speak in language that they understand. We have to find young people who will speak to young people. We have to do something about addressing that massive gap that is widening. It's not shrinking, it's widening. And I think coming here, to me, hands up, 20 plus years I've lived in Wiltshire, I've never been here before. Coming here today was fantastic. I wish I'd come much earlier and had a chance to see round. The atmosphere, the feel of this place is brilliant. The work it is doing in communicating values to people, not because it's there, sitting there lecturing people, but because of what it's doing and the ability it gives for people to come and do something. Patrick said something very profound earlier on this evening, which is about the fact that actually you need to do things, practically do things, and you will learn by doing more than you will ever get by any amount of studying. This place offers that opportunity. The Haven offers that kind of opportunity. There are places that offer that. We need more places that offer that opportunity, and a variety, a diversity of ways in which we can engage people and actually bring them in and start their love affair with actually the natural world. I think that's the key.
Someone's had their hand up for several times, the lady in the red top.
In some ways, what you've discussed is in part answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. I live in an end-terraced house in West Swindon Estate, and before we got the allotment, we started working on the land, and we ended up, the back garden was shady, and so we started working on the front garden.
And the comments from my neighbours, what's she growing those there for? I happen to have the surplus, but they haven't got a clue about what we've been talking about. They really haven't. So how do we do it? We have the Link magazine, but do they read it? Is what's happening in the schools getting through to the adults? I don't know. But what is there available that will actually get through to the people that I live with, the next door neighbours, the lady over the road who shaves the lawn every week, that kind of thing. I'm not expecting them to change what they do in their gardens, it'd be nice, but so they can understand why I'm doing what I am.
Well, don't be despondent about it, because actually some of the most difficult people who start at a place where we really don't want to be can change. We've had the most wonderful experience in Wiltshire Wildlife Trust working with unemployed young people between ages of 18 and 24 through a programme called the Future Jobs Fund. And Simon should take a great deal of credit for a lot of that. And part of the original philosophy was that we would basically indoctrinate them. We had them for 6 months, and they would do a resilience training course. We had to make sure that if they spent 6 months with us, they would learn how to survive the perfect storm that Patrick was talking about. How will they survive? There's the economic crisis which they're facing, that's why they're unemployed. But there are the problems of climate change and resource depletion, the energy crisis, and so on. We have to give them something which will build up their personal resilience. And the personal testimonies of those individuals have been fantastic. We've just done a very short little report about it, just 4 sides of A4 to give to MPs. And I gave a copy of that to all of my trustees, because we have a meeting tomorrow. And the president of the trust had shown it to his wife, and he said to me yesterday, he said, fantastic report. He said, I showed it to Victoria, he said, it brought her to tears, because it was just talking about the transformation of those young people's lives. They didn't start in a very happy place. That's the truth of the matter. And yet they've come away, they've learned how to grow food, they've learned how to cook food, they've learned about a whole range of environmental issues, they've learned a whole load of social skills, they've learned to eat together, to talk and not talk at the same time, but to listen to one another. They've learned a variety of those skills, and it's been fantastic, it's been transformational. I've seen that, tranche after tranche, and we're in our 3rd tranche of these young people. I've seen that. I take huge heart from that. My chairman says it's probably the most important thing we've done for years of working with these young people, because it shows us what can be done. What we need to do is much, much, much more of that.
Who wants to follow that with a question? You've tried a few times.
I work with the unemployed, and I totally concur with what you said. I picked up 2 things. One was that you said people don't care, they're not passionate about it. And you said the person in the supermarket that does it for £1 to identify pain. The thing that you have also identified is there are many different ways to get the message to different groups. I suspect, and from my own personal experience, is you have to understand the motivation of the person. So something like which you said, which I didn't know about, but hadn't made the connection, was about the water. Where the masses who are unemployed or on low wages, you're not going to get them to change their buying power on because they just can't afford it. Also, they're just too busy living and just trying to survive. What might help is if you give a case of, if you did this, you'll save this. And I don't think that message is coming out, and I concur with the lady over there, how do you get the message out? Because you're talking to almost a vested interest here. People do, by very nature, believe in it by being here. Those aren't the people you need to change, the ones that aren't here. And that's about what you've already said on many occasions, is how to get them to understand those things. You won't get them to understand. They've got to want to understand and see what the benefits is to them and their lifestyle's going to change.
Can I just add two things? One is that this idea of the tipping point, that, you know, you get to a certain level of awareness and then something starts to happen, and it's about sort of communication fields really, that, you know, things, an idea comes into the world, and when there's 1% of the people who understand it, it's nowhere, and it's 2%, it's 3%, and then when it gets to 5%, if the idea, if the time is right, then something starts to happen, and the spread of the idea starts jumping, which in a way which defies the maths, you know, and that idea I think is right. I think that with any transformational change, the hard work is with the early adopters come in and they struggle away and they think it's never going to happen, and then something happens, and if the idea's time is right, you get to 5%, and then incremental change can start to happen more quickly. So that's one, I think, we have to think about. Also, we mustn't be too adversarial. I personally think that. I think we need to be much more inclusive and not create an us and them situation. And the other thing is that I think there are going to be external shocks which are going to shock everyone, which we don't know what they are almost by definition, but things are going to break down. There's going to be some series of shocks which are going to make everybody think much more deeply than they have until now about the food crunch. And if that happened, that would then allow people to create a better environment. So I just think we don't know what's around the corner, but I think if the change is coming, and sense that. And it's like if we give up on it, it's like waiting for a wave that we never think is going to come. And actually, we need to wake up because the wave's like almost upon us. I think that we're on the threshold of a huge change, and it's people like you that are going to be the role model for, you know, your garden growing rhubarb or whatever it is, or soft fruit or whatever, vegetables, is going to be what everybody else is going to copy.
This discussion is going really well, and we'll take a couple more questions. But I'm sensing it's sort of meandering a bit, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each panel member, as we have the next couple of questions, to just try to think of one key point, one-liner that they would like people to hold in their heads as they leave. So as well as answering the next couple of questions, you'll have to do that as well, if that's okay. Because it's a nice meandering discussion, but I'm losing the cut. So the lady in the green jacket, you haven't had a question yet.
I don't work with people, and there have been some perspectives, I'm a scientist, and there's been some perspectives raised about people who do work with people, like unemployed people, so I'm going right outside my comfort zone here. But it seems to me that it's not necessarily elitism that puts people off the change, because there's a lot of things that people aspire to that they are very driven by, a BMW or whatever. It seems to me that it's more along the lines of worthiness that puts people off. And in that regard, and Patrick, you might not like this, but it's quite topical. It seems at the moment, Prince Charles is viewed as so worthy, but Prince William, he's the it guy at the moment. So I'm interested just in your, where's our opportunity to get some non-worthy champions here? If the youth are coming up and they're able to take on these ideas and they just need exposure to the ideas, is Prince William a case study of that? Can we use him? I think elitism can be quite good. It's just worthiness that can put people right off.
Where does Jamie Oliver rate in that then?
He's not very, it doesn't strike me as very worthy. And
I'm going to say something really bad.
Okay, go on then.
I'm going to say something really bad. I don't know where to start. What I'm going to say is, years ago when I was a kid, my dad dug his garden. He went to work every day, he dug holes in the road for Bristol Waterworks. We lived in a council house, he come home and he dug his garden. He grew everything for everybody, you know, for the family, and he had a surplus and took it to the shop and did all that. And that's what everybody did up there. It was no different, everybody did it. And people went off and that's what they did, and it was just life. And I don't know where it went or what happened or why that disappeared, but it did. Times moved on, you know, the consumer culture and all this. And if there's one thing, and oh God, I get slaughtered for this. If there's one thing that gets my goat now, I said to my George, one of my boys the other day, I said, I don't know how they managed to dig a garden without benefit of somebody on the telly like Hugh Fernie Whittingstall, all these folk that have got a bag of money, and I'm sorry, they've got a bag of money that they've made. And it does put people off. I'm sick of it now. I don't want to see it. I just think I don't want to watch that anymore. Go out and dig your garden, do what you do, and people will either do it or they won't, but you don't need those folk telling you.
Do the other worthy members of the panel?
No, I don't. But I mean, you've got guys on TV like that, like celebrity guys, that are at it and they're going, oh, you should do this and do that. And you go, well, all right, Jamie, do you know what I mean? That's fine. You've got a lovely garden and stuff, and a gardener, but people that live here in a council house here can't see how they're going to get there, and that's what they think they're going to need.
Is that not the point?
Because in a way you're being sold a thing again. It's another form, it's become another form. And, you know, read the papers, The Guardian, The Observer, they're full of it. It's like the next hit thing. Oh, you know, we've got a garden. You know, these people were driving about in BMWs 10 years ago. They were flash. Yeah, it's a lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, for the panel though, is this not the point that a number of people have raised about a new generation of champions, a new type of champion? I don't know if people want to
say something. I've just had a nice experience. We've got some new neighbours living next door, and there's a little girl who's 10, and I was in my greenhouse one day and she came down, she said, can I help you? So I gave her the watering can and she was watering some plants. I said, and they've got an empty greenhouse which was a bit dilapidated, and she didn't know anything. She said, my mum doesn't know anything about gardening. But they'd let me have the greenhouse. I said, well, would you like to plant some tomato seeds? And we did that, and I kept them in my greenhouse, and she came in and watered them. And when they came up, we put them into little pots, and she took them round to hers. She was coming round to me and saying, can I borrow your watering can? Then I had some cabbage plants spare, so she's taken some of those. And the people that lived there before had got nice little raised beds. They needed digging over. They'd also got a lovely compost bin, which was full of lovely compost that had been there for about a year. And so one day she said, could you help me put my cabbage plants in, because I don't know what to do. So we went round and we were digging it over, and I said, let's go and see what's in the compost bin. And she went, ugh, and didn't like the look of it, you know, but it was all really good, nice compost. And we were putting that in the bed and digging it in. And then I said, I'll show you how to plant the plants. And she did a row, and then she came and watered them, and I had to do some more. And this has gone on, and she's now got some cucumber plants and some tomato plants growing in the bottom of the greenhouse. They're looking better than mine. It was too cold for me to put mine outside. I can't grow mine except in pots in the greenhouse. It's been a really nice experience. She's been very encouraging, and she's really enjoying what she's doing. And it's all came from her, but she just needed a bit of time from me to show what to do. I just wanted to share that experience.
Fancy moving into a house with raised beds and compost. One last question.
Sorry, can I just add to?
Oh, right, that's that.
Virtually all the primary schools around here now have got gardens, quite substantial cottage gardens almost, and you know, and several have their own eco groups, so they're going out and looking after the grounds and the one across the road is just rebuilding a huge pond with a wildlife environmental area. So there's a colossal amount of work going on in schools, but it's, hopefully that can be sustained as they get older, and at least some of them will come away as they get older and feel that they're going to retain some of that knowledge and will build on it.
Thank you for that, Roger. If we can have one last opportunity for a question, preferably someone who hasn't asked one already. Well, that's killed it. At the back.
I was going to make a point. A couple of years ago, I think it was, Mark Linus was in this very room at the same Festival of Literature, and he made an interesting point that big government aren't interested in allotments and people growing things in their garden because it doesn't show in the GDP figures. There's no economic measure for them. Whereas if you've got a huge great farm, it does show up in those. I think that's a good point he made, but I've got no idea how you can possibly address it or account for it.
It's a really important point because I was one of the things that I did was I spent most of November in America, and I went to at their invitation to go and visit the Gates Foundation, who are putting $300 million a year mainly into African agriculture, with not, I would say, exactly the right approach. And the way they measure their success is in dollars. In other words, they're just looking, their outcome measure is increasing because they think poverty alleviation is their goal. So they're measuring the success in terms of the dollar income, the smallholder farmers. And I was asked to comment on their strategy, and I said, well, the thing is, if you only measure dollar income, you're missing everybody who's self-sufficient, anybody who's bartering, all that sort of below the radar stuff, which is beneath the threshold of measurement in money. You're completely not measuring that. So I think that you make a very good point. So the way in which we measure success is, from your point of view, about quality of life. We need a different set of metrics for measuring what is meaningful and deliver change.
Happiness, well-being type of nebulous.
And we need new role models as well. I mean, I think it's completely true. But I think the new role models are just coming up. I think it's partly from the schools. I think, the young people, they get this stuff in a completely different way. So I think they will replace, ancient people like me and, other worthies who've been preaching, and that puts people off. And so I think that there's about to be a kind of new generation of people who are going to come up, and we don't know who they are, but they'll just kind of emerge, who will be the new champions of this, and it won't all be, posh people.
I think the question about GDP actually is really a very profound one, and I'm encouraged, probably a little bit strongly than that, by the fact that the government has said that it wants to begin to look at the question of happiness. I think it's a really important start. It's only a start. There's a huge debate as to how you'd measure it, and a lot of people laughed at it. But actually, GDP doesn't measure the things that we truly value. Actually, and that was said in a brilliant speech back in 1965, I think, by Kennedy, and about all the things that truly matter don't get measured, and the things that actually you hate about life all count towards GDP. And so they are the wrong set of metrics. So we do have to find different ways to record the sense of wellness, of happiness, of wholeness, just the well-being in society. But I think, if I may, Simon, just to try and draw together two threads. One is about institutional, structural things, about how do you measure, how do you interest big government in all of this. And the other is a lovely story about how you've sat there and worked with this young person, explaining about how you grow things. Almost two extremes there. And so I know someone wants to wrap up and so on, so I'm going to say, about the message to go back, is to recognise and respect the different roles that all of us play. And everybody has an important role to play. I'm very conscious that I'm sitting here, I think I'm the only person here with a tie on, okay? But I wore it because it's got, cherries and plums on it. And actually it's because I came from work and And what I was doing today was I was trying to work with those structures and institutions, talking about sustainability appraisals of core strategies. How tedious and boring does that sound? But fundamentally important to the fabric of how development is going to take place. And if we don't get it right, we're going to be in big trouble. So it's worth investing that time into it. To do that and be respected and taken seriously, you have to speak the language that they speak, behave in a sense that gives you that some sort of credibility and respect. Absolutely inappropriate dress and behaviour and language to try and work sharing the passion that you have for growing things in your greenhouse. But absolutely what you're doing is so valuable. So my message actually for tonight for people to go is simply respect and understand that everybody here has a really important role to play, and above everything else, enjoy it. Enjoy your gardens, enjoy your food, enjoy what you eat, and share that enjoyment and that passion with other people in the most natural way that comes to you, without preaching or giving a sermon or any of that sort of stuff. It's actually doing what comes naturally with you, because that is actually about gossiping and sharing and community spirit, which will actually create the fertile bed on which this change, this kairos moment that Patrick's talking about, this opportunity for the tipping point to really take root, and that's what we need to create, and that's my message to you.
Are there any other final thoughts from the panel? Key thing each.
Well, 7 key things. All I would say is work cooperatively, if you work cooperatively, shop locally, and to quote Curtis Mayfield, keep on keeping on.
Yeah, I think my thought would be, because SCAN, who's hosting this event, has been attempting to sponsor the transition notion over the last couple of years, and this is our 4th food event over a couple of years. I think maybe we might take our first teetering steps towards a food plan, something very simple, not a PhD, 75 pages worth, a couple of pages. A call to action maybe to the local authority, local organisations, members of the public, a few simple starting for 10 points. We'd maybe consider that, working that over the summer towards the autumn, and float something in the autumn possibly.
Great.
So that's my thought.
And it's appropriate for Patrick to have the final word.
I think it's been said, but I feel that we're all connected, and that everything's connected, and so one's own understanding is somehow, and one's action is in microcosm the action that's needed for the change. So I just think it's really about what I can do, because that's connected to everything else. And I just think that, for me, that makes me feel very sort of quiet in front of this extraordinary system of, we're all the whole of humanity is connected, and so we really have our own understanding contains all the ingredients of the solution somehow that is necessary to be applied on a wider level, and that makes me feel good about. Because I think there's a risk that people feel so small in the scale of all this, but in fact it's not true.
Well, I think I've got some announcements to make, but I think if at least for those 4 thoughts, before I do anything else, I think we should thank Patrick, Gary, Kath and Jerry